Welcome everyone to Embracing Minds of All Kinds, making digital content usable for people with cognitive disabilities. A quick hi from me. My name is Christina Deemer. I'm a developer at Alley, a full service digital agency. Some of our nonprofit clients include the American Association of Museums, the Kaufman Family Foundation, Direct Relief, and Cooper Union. I'm a web accessibility specialist certified by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. I am autistic. I only mention that because it's relevant to the topic here today. I live in the Philadelphia suburbs. My interests include reading, quilting, cooking, and Star Trek. And you can find me on Twitter at CAH Deemer, DEEMER. A couple of housekeeping items are that I'm a solo speaker, so I will not be monitoring the chat during the talk, but we have Nikhil here, so he'll be monitoring the chat during the talk. And there will be time for some questions at the end. And I can also answer questions or address questions on Twitter. And I also plan to attend today's conference recap session. Something I like to do when I start sessions is do a little bit of expectation setting and explicitly outline objectives and the agenda. So our objectives today are to identify some common access barriers that people with cognitive disabilities experience with digital projects, to recognize design patterns recommended by the W3C for making content usable by people with cognitive disabilities, to learn how to utilize those design patterns in our digital work, and to advocate for incorporating the design patterns into your work during all life cycle stages of a digital project. Our agenda today includes a brief discussion of terminology and language around web accessibility and the language of disability. We'll go through a toolkit of best practices. We'll look at an example digital project in real life, and then look at some next steps and resources. So I want to start by defining some terms and talking about how we talk about web accessibility and cognitive disabilities. For starters, some clarifications around language around web accessibility. I refer a great deal to the W3C, and this is the World Wide Web Consortium, the international community that develops and maintains standards for the web, including standards around accessibility. And I also refer to WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. WCAG are a part of a series of international guidelines published by the Web Accessibility Initiative of the W3C. This isn't a talk about WCAG. We're not going to review WCAG. And I hope that you're already familiar with WCAG and that your projects are already striving to meet those guidelines. And next, I'll talk about some language we use when we talk about disabilities, because best practices in this area are changing very quickly. And talking about disabilities requires some sensitivity, but I don't want that to ever mean that we avoid talking about these things. And many of the notes in this section come from the National Center on Disability and Journalism's Disability Language Style Guide, which was updated, I think, just in September. And there's a link to the style guide in the resources slide at the very end of the deck. So first of all, I'm going to use the terms disabled and disability. These are not shameful or dirty words, and they're preferred over other words, including made up terms like specially abled or handicapable. Those words are considered offensive. And you may be wondering how we're defining cognitive disabilities here. We're going to use the W3C's definition for it, which is that it's a very nebulous term that acts as a sort of umbrella term for neurodiversity, as well as neurological disorders and mental and behavioral disorders that may or may not be neurological. So if you think of Down syndrome in this category, that's right. If you think of ADHD or depression, dyslexia, anxiety, autism, sensory disorders, dementia, aphasia, traumatic brain injury, PTSD, all of those things are in this category, but we're not really going to use those terms today. And I will switch between using identity first and person first language. Identity first language mentions the disability first. An example would be saying something like autistic person, while person first language mentions the person first, something like person with dyslexia. Person first language is no longer considered a default, and it's important to understand that some disabled people strongly prefer identity first language, and several disability groups have long preferred identity first language, including the culturally deaf community and the autistic rights community. So during this talk, you'll hear me use both. And whenever you can, you should ask people with disabilities what language they prefer. And I'm going to use functional over clinical terms today when we talk about barriers for people with cognitive disabilities. That means instead of talking about specific clinical diagnoses, I said we're not going to be talking about like things like ADHD, but that can be helpful for people with when it comes to getting support or treatment, getting that right diagnosis. But I'm instead going to talk about underlying cognitive skills. So instead of talking about ADHD, I'll talk about issues with focus. And I'm doing this because not everyone with a cognitive disability is aware of their disability or has a diagnosis. For example, some people spend years unaware that their problems with reading comprehension are due to dyslexia. They don't know that they have a disability. And some people don't have access to diagnosis due to a variety of systemic barriers. And many people have more than one diagnosis. If someone who lives with depression and ADHD has trouble focusing, does it matter to us if it's due to the depression or the ADHD? And there also may be other intersectional issues at play. And not everyone with a particular disability experiences it in the same way. There's a saying in the autism community that if you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So just because digital content is accessible to somebody like me, it doesn't mean that it's accessible to every autistic person. It just means that it's accessible to me. So there are lots of shades of gray here. Using functional terms over cognitive or cognitive skills over clinical terms also helps us focus on aspects of cognitive disabilities that have an impact on the way people use the web. So it helps us focus on things like memory issues, problem solving and decision making, attention and focus, time management, processing speed, math comprehension, and language and reading comprehension. This is not a full list of cognitive skills, it's just some examples. And some other issues that people with cognitive disabilities struggle with on the web may include things like impulse control, abstractions, and sarcasm. So with that out of the way, let's get into our toolkit. These are 7 recommendations from the W3C that you can implement to make your digital content more accessible to people with cognitive disabilities. They range in specificity and cover design, engineering, editorial, and security. So a little bit of everything. The toolkit's based on a working group note published by the W3C in April 2021. What I'm talking about today is just a subset of the practices they recommend. Again, it assumes that that WCAG success criteria have already been met. So it's additive, it does not replace WCAG, and it's not part of WCAG. WCAG does include some guidelines and success criteria that can be applied to users with cognitive disabilities, but it's been pointed out by a number of experts, and most important by disabled people, that the W3C has really struggled to establish guidelines that address the needs of users with cognitive disabilities, in part because that category covers such a wide range of folks. The working group note, though, has been a really positive sign that more attention will be paid to the barriers that users with cognitive disabilities face on the web, which hopefully will lead to more formal recommendations in time. And everything in the toolkit is non-standard and or non-normative. You don't need to implement it to meet WCAG. The things in the toolkit can't be tested with existing automated tools. You can develop, for the engineers in the room, you can develop tests around certain aspects of the toolkit. That's something that I would advise, but for the most part, a lot of this has to be tested by hand, or you have to come up with your own checklists. And So you have to do a bit of that work yourself. But let's get into those toolkit items now. The first tool is common design patterns. That includes some basic things like putting the home page in the top left and putting the search in the top right, and making links look like links and buttons look like buttons. Links and buttons are not the same thing. Links navigate to a new page and buttons perform an action. And create an obvious visual hierarchy. It should be clear on any page and any section of the page what's most important. Secondary information should be farther down on the page and smaller. It's important to do this because new design metaphors can be hard to learn, and learning a new layout can be a totally unnecessary challenge for people with difficulties processing, making decisions, or remembering things. To advocate this, do that during the design phase, and you want to do that so that you don't have to make costly remediation steps later after users complain that they can't find things. If you do user testing and this kind of issue is discovered, great, but it's even better if you can catch this in the design phase of a project. The second tool in your toolkit is media that's in chunks. You want to divide your video and audio clips into chunks that are short and logical. The W3C recommends chunks that are 6 minutes or less. And again, you want to provide unique navigation for each chunk so that they're easy to jump into and out of. And this is important because users with difficulties with attention and focus can really struggle with media that's too long. You'll want to talk to whoever's involved in cutting the videos or planning the audio as early on as possible about accessibility, so you can work together to make thoughtful decisions about how to chunk your content. If 6 minutes doesn't work, maybe there are other places where you can divide media files. You can also set expectations during project planning phases. So there isn't an expectation that that the content will be in 15-minute or heaven help you like hour-long chunks. Set the expectations as early on as possible that media would be in chunks that are 6 minutes or less. The next tool in our toolkit is a friendly search mechanism that includes autocomplete and spell check. This becomes particularly important as the site complexity increases and people rely more on search to find things. This is important because search functionality that demands complete, accurately spelled words can fail users with language impairments and memory issues. The great thing here is that you can advocate for this at any point in a project life cycle. And you can remind everybody on your team this is an example of an accessibility improvement that doesn't have a big impact on visual design and will be immediately valuable to a wide range of users. Many enterprise level search tools, I think like Elasticsearch, comes with autocomplete and spell check. And depending on your CMS, there may be plugins that will add this functionality to your search. So just because it's not built into your site search doesn't mean it can't be added. But this is something where you should definitely, if you're not an engineer, talk to the engineers on your team who will be the experts in identifying the right solution for your project given your tech stack. The fourth tool in our toolkit is the humble back button, which should exist in every site, in-gallery interactive, kiosk, online exhibition, and game. It's great if you can rely on native browser back buttons, but there are cases where browser controls are hidden or don't work. And in those cases, back buttons are critical. It's important that go back and start over controls are distinctive. The back button allows users to review progress and correct mistakes and retrace their steps, while starting over means resetting data. You may not need to think about this much for a standard museum brochure site, unless you're talking about like shopping carts or anywhere where you have a multi-step form. But you may also need to consider this in gallery interactives or any sort of kiosk that has a strict user flow, or where actually like the physical casing covers up the browser buttons intentionally. Online exhibitions and games are also notorious for issues with going back. Back buttons are important because users need to be able to review their progress and correct mistakes. Mistakes can include things like touching a control by accident or activating a link by accident. Enabling users to go back can help users with anxiety and memory issues, as well as users who have difficulties following instructions can help them complete tasks successfully because they can review information, retrace their steps, look at their responses again, that sort of thing. And it's best if you can advocate for this during the design phase of a project, but I've had people call this suggestion unnecessary, only to have users bump up against it during testing. So a little trick that I've developed is to ask a question in a format that's something like, how would a user with like language comprehension issues go back and ensure that they entered data correctly? And that tactic of formatting the question that way can help convey the importance and impact of that kind of feature. Our fifth tool is to employ a simple user interface. That means our interface doesn't include text that runs edge to edge, that we can break up content with headings, so pages can be easily scanned. And if there's a lot of text on the page, consider putting a summary at the top. It also helps to make it easy to dismiss pop-ups and banners and other distracting features, and avoid including those things at all during critical steps in a process. And when it's time for users to make decisions, limit them to 5 or fewer choices. And if there are actually more than 5 choices, put them into subgroups so that the initial options are still 5 or fewer. And this is important because messages can just get lost when there's too much information and activity. Those busy, crowded screens can cause anxiety, and users with attention issues can lose focus and abandon their task. It's most important to be aware of this issue during a project's maintenance phase, when small features can get piled onto a simple interface without the team understanding their cumulative effect. So you have like a ribbon about COVID guidelines on the top of every page, and then there's a membership pop-up that comes up when the user scroll down to 1/3 of the page, and an ad for a new exhibition features some like exciting animations, and that's in the sidebar. And each of these things alone isn't a big deal, but together they can create an unwelcoming experience that can actually prevent users from completing a task or accessing content. Our sixth tool is a login that doesn't rely on memory. So don't make users memorize character strings, perform calculations, solve puzzles, or recognize characters on a screen and input them into a field. This is important because users should be able to log in, register, and reset their credentials without more effort than it takes to navigate a standard web page. Inaccessible login or authentication mechanisms affect a variety of users with cognitive disabilities. People with memory impairments may not be able to log in if they don't remember their passwords. People with language and math impairments may struggle to solve puzzles or input characters correctly with a limited number of attempts. And time-limited procedures may also block just a number of users from accessing their accounts. For advocacy, I just put here be dragons, because there are just a lot of competing priorities here, and devising logins or authentication mechanisms that are both accessible and secure involves a real team effort and a commitment of resources to sort it out. So even though this one's just a little bit more complex, I wanted to mention it because accessible authentication is under consideration as a new success criteria for WCAG, for WCAG 2.2, which is scheduled to become the standard at some point in 2022. And that would mean that if your login process doesn't allow people to paste in passwords or forces them to complete a cognitive test, it would be in violation of WCAG under the new guidelines, and you could be you could be liable for legal action. But this is, that's not the case yet. This is not part of this current standard. This is just really a hot topic in accessibility right now because it could be part of the standard. The details are still being discussed. And I just wanted to give you a heads up in case you wanted to do more research on it or get involved in those discussions of what accessible authentication means. Our final tool in our toolkit is help or instructions for complex and non-standard controls. This includes complex forms, unusual interactions, non-standard controls, creative interfaces, and required actions that don't support autocomplete. So surveys with complex interactions, definitely games, any sort of like game that you have in a gallery or on your site, data entry where there can be confusion about the required format. So in those cases, it helps to include accessible text next to the non-standard control and to use very clear and unambiguous instructions. So those are our 7 items in the toolkit. We're just going to do a quick little recap. Oh, I forgot a slide. There we go. So we'll talk about this. Sorry about that. So this is important. Our help is important because it's easy to get lost or confused when something doesn't operate in the way that you expect. This affects users who have issues with anxiety, cognitive processing speeds, and math or language comprehension. They may give up on a task or require additional assistance. And this is definitely an area where a little bit of user testing can go a long way and can make a big difference because you can, through user testing, identify exactly where forms or controls or a game board or whatever are confusing and make adjustments based on what you hear in testing. Okay, now that's it. Is that right? Yes. Okay, so now we're going to do our little recap of our 7 tools here. So we've got use common design patterns. So users who struggle with decision-making and memory don't have to learn new visual metaphors. Divide media into chunks. So users with attention impairments don't lose focus and can stay engaged. Employ a friendly search mechanism. So users with language and reading comprehension issues can successfully find things. Ensure apps have a back button. So users who struggle to follow instructions or have memory issues can check their work and correct mistakes. Use a simple interface so users who struggle to stay focused or get easily overwhelmed can successfully complete tasks. Provide options for logging in that don't rely on memory or tests so users with memory and cognition issues can successfully access their accounts. And provide help for non-standard and complex controls so users who struggle with reading and math comprehension, anxiety, and decision-making can complete tasks independently. Cool. So we're going to take all of those recommendations from the W3C and we're going to put them into practice by doing a brief exercise where I'll evaluate an award-winning online project and exhibition through the lens of the toolkit. The project is called Duty to Country, and it was created by the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project. I actually didn't have anything to do with this at all. Wasn't involved in the planning, the design, the development, anything about it. I just think it's cool. It's called it's at dutytocountry.org. I'm going to browse to the site right now. But feel free to look on your own, and I'm going to give myself a 3-minute timer here. And okay. So here is the site. And you can see that they're using the common design pattern of having the link to the homepage in the top left and search in the top right. Their media here, we already can see from the timer, is a short 4 minutes and 5 seconds. So Not too long there. Scroll down, we can see all the awards they've won. And my head is turned to the side right now because I have the exhibition up on the second monitor. We see our interface is relatively simple. We can focus on the content that's important. We're using headings. We've got lots of space here. Not a lot of distractions. We're just going to scroll down to the bottom here. Oh, we saw that's where our online exhibition is. There are many ways for us to find it. Scrolling down here. Okay. And before we go to that online exhibition, we're going to check out the search. And I'm going to intentionally spell Philippines incorrectly. Philippines has 1 L and 2 P's, but I'm going to spell it with 2 L's and 1 P and see what happens. Okay, we've got no autocomplete and no spell check on that. So, so if there's something really specific that you were looking for on the site, you'd have to know exactly what it is and how to spell it, because you wouldn't get any help from the search tool. We're going to use our back button here. We can rely on that browser control and go to our online exhibition. Sometimes I have a little bit of problem with some abstractions and I always don't know what explore means, but I know from the heading that this is probably going to go to our online exhibition. Okay. And maybe you don't know what to do here. Oh, but then we've got an animation with helper text there that lets us know we're supposed to scroll to begin the introduction. So that helper text is very important. I'm going to click here on our introduction. And I'm scrolling down. It would have been helpful to have that helper text there again, letting me know where to go. Continuing to scroll down. And again, our content is very nicely chunked up so that we know exactly what we're focusing on and things aren't too long. We have another bit of media here. Just going to check my timer. Oh, my timer went off. Okay. But I know that this video is 45 seconds. So we saw that the media again was in nice chunks. Let's go back to our slides. There we go. So here's sort of some of my takeaways from that short exercise that our example site employs common design patterns, so users don't have to learn new visual metaphors. The media is in nice short chunks that are less than 6 minutes, so users can stay focused. A sort of something that I would tell them needed to be remediated would be to add autocomplete or spell check to their search mechanism, so users can find things more easily. The browser buttons work as expected, so users can easily retrace their steps. The interface is simple, so users can complete tasks without getting overwhelmed. This is a case where no login is needed, so that one isn't relevant. And they had that nice little bit of help text for the non-standard controls, so you knew what you were expected to do. I maybe would have employed that sort of in each instance where you're supposed to scroll down so the user can really like learn what they're supposed to do, but the little bit that they had there was nice. But something that I really hope that you'll take away here is that they do a lot of things right. Accessible features can be beautiful and creative, and sometimes even award-winning sites aren't perfect, but really accessibility features can go hand in hand with good design. So some next steps and resources. It's really beyond the scope of this talk to get into the details about testing with real users with cognitive disabilities, but I can point out some special considerations you may need to make. Take time to figure out what accommodations testers will need and make sure there are no surprises in testing location, the testing format, or the content of the test. And if users need to bring caretakers or support, find out in advance and allow it, make sure that they're on security lists. And ensure that testers know that if something goes wrong, if they can't complete a task, if something is confusing, if there's any sort of bug in design or develop or functionality, that it's not their fault, they've done nothing wrong. This is something that we normally do with user testing, but it's important to just really make that abundantly clear when it comes to these users. And make it clear that testers are in control. They can ask questions at any time, they can take breaks, and they can stop at any time. And compensate disabled testers in the same way you would any other testers. You might even consider increasing compensation for these testers as they have specialized expertise. If this is something that you're interested in, there's a lot more detail about testing with users with cognitive disabilities in the working group note, and that's included in the resources slides at the end of the deck. You may be saying, this is great, Christina, but how do I get buy-in from my team? How do I incorporate testing? How do I make sure that people even care about users with cognitive disabilities? And no matter where you are in the life cycle of a project, my approach involves two steps. One is to make a multidimensional argument for accessibility. You can talk about the legal case for it. And you can talk about the business case for it, how as age increases, disability increases. And you can tie accessibility into your organization's strategic goals, mission, and values. You can make sure that disabled users are considered when you're talking about DEI. And along with sort of that rationale for accessibility, you can make a specific plan. I think it helps tremendously if you can outline the specific measures that need to be taken to make a site more accessible. There's a misconception that accessibility is really burdensome, time intensive, and costly. So outlining the specific steps needed to remediate accessibility issues and prioritizing those issues based on severity and cost can help combat those misconceptions. It can help to do an audit first. There's also a misconception that designers need to compromise their creative vision to make a site accessible. But as we just saw, like accessible sites can be creative and beautiful. It's also helpful to point out when accessibility changes have no visual impact. Incorporating autocomplete into search functionality doesn't have much of a visual impact, for example. So our final takeaways for today are to focus on functional terms rather than clinical diagnoses. So consider how people with memory, focus and attention, time management, decision-making, anxiety, processing speed, and math and language comprehension struggles, how they might use your site or engage with your content. And break up that content into pieces, chunk the media into 6-minute blocks, use headings liberally, don't crowd the page, and make the implicit explicit. Make sure your buttons have text along with icons. You may want to use breadcrumbs so users better know where they are. Just make things clear for folks, and provide help where you can. Back buttons, autocomplete in searches, letting users copy and paste passwords in, using magical links, like be a good, be a friend, and advocate for accessibility throughout a project's life cycle. You can use prompts like, I wonder how someone with a cognitive disability would do X, or this feature doesn't meet the needs of people with time management issues because of Y. And remember that all of this can be done without compromising the creative vision of a project, and it usually can be done without sort of breaking the bank, but it can't be done alone. A lot of this takes a team effort, so involve everyone on your team to make your project more accessible to people with cognitive disabilities. And I think that is it. And we have, so thanks everybody for joining me today. I think we have some time for questions. Nikhil maybe was going to.
Yeah, so
Hi.
folks, please put your questions in the chat, raise your hand, or just chime in. I do have a few questions of my own that I can maybe throw out on the table while we wait for folks to chime their questions in. So first, just thank you so much, Christina. I appreciate the concrete tools that you provided us as we sort of try to think about how to make our tools, platforms, and applications more usable for a wider group of people. And I appreciate your framing of just be a friend, right? So looking at websites that museums and cultural institutions have created, and also looking at websites outside of the museum sector, do you feel like there's a website or two you could name that is doing this type of engineering and designing well?
Yeah, I think I actually did a bit of poking around, and I think a lot of people are incorporating bits of this. And I don't know if there's anybody out there who gets an A+, and I don't know if there's anybody out there that's failing, but I see a lot of people, a lot of organizations like making effort, and no matter where you are in terms of budget size or market, like start with where you are and implement the steps that are easier for you. Some of the larger institutions may be able to tackle something like accessible authentication, and that may be sort of a challenge to figure out like all of the ways in which you can make it easier for people to log in. But I don't have any examples of anybody who's doing anything sort of perfectly, but I know that people are definitely making an effort overall.
Mm-hmm. We got a question from Marty. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, thank you. This is really great. I would just, I'm often in a position of speaking to designers at the beginning of a design process, and presentations like this really help them wrap their heads around what is otherwise. But I guess my question is, if you could elaborate. Sometimes I struggle to not make designers think that I'm limiting their options by bringing these things forward. They get kind of prickly, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the conversations that you've had around these issues and how to make designers feel like they still get to do what they do.
Of course. A lot of times I find that designers, once they understand the sort of restrictions that they need to work with, they can often find creative solutions. I can give you an example of how I've worked with designers on issues like color contrast, and sometimes I'll find a close, like if their shade of blue doesn't meet like WCAG's AA, like I'll find a blue that does. And without a doubt, they will come back with me with a better blue. So sometimes I try to sort of meet them halfway. I worked on a quiz project once that didn't, and I was doing the back button thing where I was like, what are users, users they're entering some sensitive information here. They're going to want to go back and review it. How can we stick in a back button? So I like sketched out, like, here's where I would put it. And the designer, I made it a back and forth with the designers, make it a conversation with them and hear about like some of their concerns about it. And I also try to speak their language. A lot of these accessibility best practices go hand in hand with usability best practices. I talk about, where things fitting in a certain way on the page. You can talk about white space. You can talk about affordances. You can just sort of show them that you're not the enemy, but at the same time, I am very, there isn't, if there's, I try to be the voice of the person that's not in the room. Like if I'm talking about color contrast and there isn't the voice of somebody with low vision in the room, like I have to be that voice. And I can be very stubborn about sticking up for the needs of disabled people. So I want to make it a conversation. I want things to look beautiful, but I'm also going to stick up for disabled people at the same time.
You've got a lot of folks echoing the question Marty raised. And in chat, Laura asks something somewhat similar. Do you have any recommendations for trying to get your external designers up to speed on accessibility practices? So not necessarily sort of bringing a specific issue up, but how to bring folks in the role of a designer gain a broader understanding of what some of these concerns are.
Right. So I've some of the tooling that that designers use these days, like Figma, has some accessibility checkers in them. So sometimes it's about like letting them know like what tools that reminding them, or letting them know about new tools that have these things integrated into them. That can help to keep them up to speed on things. I've also done you can also do sort of like workshops with designers where you bring up, where you sort of do some training on what things to look for. That can help without it being like in context of this particular project, or point people to existing checklists and that sort of thing. And you can also notice I'm sort of distracted because I see a friend of mine just asked a question in the chat. So I just want to do a special like shout out to my friend Josh. Hi, Josh. So I hope that helps, like help them learn about the tools that they have that can go through some of these accessibility checks for them, and do training outside of some of the projects.
Great, and let's go to Josh's question. We've got about 2 minutes left, so
Sure.
this might be the last one. But if
Okay.
folks have one last question you want to try to squeeze in, please get it in the chat. So a good friend of yours and mine, Josh, asks, what about working with content creators to improve content? At the Art Institute, we think of accessibility corrections falling into either design development or content development. So do you have any thoughts on how to bridge the gap where design and development might be on a different track from editorial?
Yeah, I think again, like I think trying to handle that editorial feels like it's on a different track, and trying to give them more direct, more teamwork, so that people don't feel like they're are working in silos in that way. And improving content, again, like some CMSs have built-in accessibility tools that can help content creators understand the issues that may come up in their content, but there also may be, again, some training that can be done. Something that I've talked to content creators about is the importance of not using links that contain the words like click here or just here. So just making sure that that content creators have a seat at the table as well, so that they're not siloed off, can be helpful.
Great, and there's much appreciation coming your way, Christina, in the chat. So thank you so much for your thought and attention in this session.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate your being here. And thank you so much for all that you do in your institution.